May 21, 1940, near Arras, France. The rumble of diesel engines echoed across the rolling French countryside as 16 Matilda Secu infantry tanks, their 78mm thick armour gleaming dully in the morning light, advanced toward German positions. Behind them, 58 lighter Matilda I tanks followed in support. What German General Erwin Rommel and his 7th Panzer Division didn't yet know was that they were about to encounter a weapon that would render their standard anti-tank guns useless. That weapon was the British Ordnance QF 2-pounder, a 40mm gun mounted in the turrets of those advancing Matildas and deployed on the ground by Royal Artillery crews. This is the story of how a small-caliber gun, often dismissed by history as inadequate, became the backbone of British anti-tank defence in the war's opening years, and how its crews learned to use terrain, surprise and close-range ambush tactics to destroy panzers that outgunned them on paper. This is the story of the British 2-pounder, and the men who made it deadly at close quarters. The origins of the 2-pounder stretch back to 1934, when the British War Office issued a requirement for a new 40mm anti-tank gun. The interwar period had seen most nations underinvest in their militaries, and Britain was no exception. Tank development had progressed, and the anti-tank rifles of the previous decade were becoming obsolete. What the British needed was a weapon that could defeat the armour of contemporary tanks, while remaining mobile enough to keep pace with mechanised forces. The specification called for standardisation. The same gun would serve both as a towed anti-tank weapon and as the main armament for British tanks, ensuring economy of production and logistics. Vickers Armstrong received the development contract and began work immediately. The design that emerged was technically sophisticated for its time. The gun itself was a 40mm weapon with a caliber length of 52, giving it a respectable muzzle velocity of 2,126 feet per second. It fired a 2.4-pound armour-piercing projectile, hence the name 2-pounder. The ballistics were impressive for the mid-1930s. At 500 yards, the gun could penetrate 53mm of vertical armour plate, enough to defeat any tank then in service or on the drawing board. But it was the carriage design that made the 2-pounder unique among anti-tank guns of its era. While most nations opted for conventional split-trail carriages that allowed limited traverse, the British chose an innovative 3-legged cruciform platform. In travelling position, one leg served as a towing trail while the other 2 folded up. When emplaced for combat, the crew would lower all 3 legs to the ground and lift the wheels clear. This arrangement provided rock-solid stability and something no other anti-tank gun of the period possessed: a full 360 degrees of traverse. The gunner could engage targets from any direction without having to manhandle the entire weapon around. 2 traverse speeds were available, a fast mode for acquiring targets, and a slower, more precise mode for final aiming. The traverse gear was so well designed that the gun commander could rotate the weapon simply by pushing against the gunner's shoulders, using a simple ring and bead sight mounted atop the shield for quick target acquisition. The gunner himself used a 1.9x magnification telescopic sight with a 21-degree field of view, graduated from 600 to 800 yards at 300-yard intervals. The 2-pounder featured a semi-automatic vertical sliding breech block that ejected the spent cartridge case automatically, allowing a well-trained crew to achieve rates of fire up to 22 rounds per minute. Ready ammunition was stored in a magazine locker on the shield's lower right, holding 4 rows of 40mm projectiles within easy reach of the loader. The crew was protected by a metal shield at the front, though this offered limited protection against anything heavier than small arms fire and shell fragments. Weight was the price paid for this sophisticated design. At 48 pounds in travelling configuration, the 2-pounder was heavier than comparable guns from other nations. The German 37mm Pak-36 weighed just 950 pounds, while the American 37mm M3 came in at 912 pounds. This weight difference would have significant tactical implications once combat began. By October 1935, the gun was accepted for service as the Ordnance QF 2-pounder Mark IX. Production began slowly. Vickers submitted the first carriage design, designated Mark the Wand, and a limited number were built in 1936. Woolwich Arsenal continued development work on their own carriage design. When reassessed, the Woolwich design proved superior, cheaper, and easier to produce. It was adopted as the Mark II carriage. though it required removing the wheels entirely when emplacing the gun for combat. This carriage became the standard, and both Vickers and Woolwich manufactured it. The first 2-pounder guns entered service with the Royal Artillery in 1938, when 5 field brigades were converted to anti-tank regiments. By 1939, production was accelerating, but the gun remained in relatively short supply. When war broke out in September 1939, the British Army had fewer than 400 2-pounders in inventory. More were desperately needed. In 1939, the British approached Canada to augment domestic production. Canadian factories would eventually produce significant numbers of 2-pounders, though ironically, the Canadian Army would never use them in combat overseas. In 1936, when the 2-pounder was adopted, it was genuinely the best anti-tank gun in the world. Its penetration exceeded that of its contemporaries. The German 37mm Pak-36 could only penetrate 36mm of armour at 500 metres, while the 2-pounder managed 53mm at the same range. Against the tanks of 1936, Panzers with 13mm of armour, Panzer IIs with 14.5mm, and even early Panzer IIIs with 30mm of frontal armour, the 2-pounder was more than adequate. The problem was that tank development didn't stand still. By the time significant numbers of 2-pounders reached the field in 1939 and 1940, German tank armour had thickened considerably. The Panzer WWII SFF, entering service in 1940, carried 30mm of frontal armour, upgradable to 60mm with bolted-on plates. The Panzer WWII featured 50mm of frontal armour. While the 2-pounder could still penetrate these thicknesses at close range, its effective engagement envelope was shrinking rapidly. There was another, even more critical shortcoming. The 2-pounder was never issued with high explosive ammunition. This decision stemmed from pre-war doctrine and testing. Engineers calculated that a 40mm high explosive shell, weighing about the same as a Mills bomb hand grenade, would contain so little explosive that it would be ineffective against personnel, buildings, or unarmoured targets. From a tank perspective, this was a serious limitation. British tanks armed with a 2-pounder could not engage enemy anti-tank guns, infantry positions, or soft-skinned vehicles except with their machine guns. For infantry anti-tank units, the lack of HE meant they couldn't suppress enemy gun positions or fight back against infantry assaults. When British and German anti-tank units encountered each other, the Germans could lay down high explosive fire with their 37mm and 50mm guns, while British crews had only armour-piercing shot. This asymmetry would cost lives. High explosive ammunition was actually developed later in the war, but by the time it might have been produced, the 2-pounder was being phased out. The opportunity was lost. When the German invasion of France began on May 10, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force deployed to meet them. The BEF had approximately 400 2-pounder anti-tank guns in 2 types of formations. Infantry divisions had anti-tank regiments, with 4 batteries of 12 guns each, totaling 48 guns per division. Armoured divisions had light anti-aircraft/anti-tank regiments, with 2 12-gun batteries. Additionally, 2-pounders armed British tanks. The 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments formed the 1st Army Tank Brigade, the only significant British armoured force in France. They fielded 58 Matilda tanks armed only with machine guns, and 16 precious Matilda II tanks mounting 2-pounder guns. Those 16 Matilda IIs represented the most heavily armoured tanks on the battlefield. With 78mm of frontal armour, they were virtually immune to German anti-tank weapons. The question was whether their 2-pounder guns could make a difference. The answer came on May 21, 1940 at Arras. By this point in the campaign, German Panzer columns had punched through the French front and were racing toward the Channel coast, threatening to encircle the BEF. British and French commanders planned a counterattack to cut the German corridor. The British contribution, designated Frankforce, was modest. Only about 2,000 men from the Durham Light Infantry and approximately 74 tanks from the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments would make the attack. The force was split into left and right columns, advancing south from Arras. The mission seemed almost suicidal given the size of German forces in the area, but the British had one advantage. Their Matilda tanks were nearly impervious to German anti-tank fire. The German 37mm Pak-36, the standard anti-tank gun, couldn't penetrate Matilda armour except at point-blank range. When the attack began around 2:30 in the afternoon, The results were immediate and dramatic. The left column smashed through German positions at Dainville, overran anti-tank guns at Aquicourt, and pushed on to Agny and Beaurain. Gunners of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment reported their 2-pounders going through German tanks like paper. Lieutenant Colonel H.M. Hayland, commanding the 7th RTR in the right column, bypassed the town of Wallace to maintain momentum and pushed toward Wylie. There, they collided with troops from the SS Totenkopf division. The encounter was brutally one-sided. Matilda II's ploughed through German positions. Their 2-pounders, firing armour-piercing shot at ranges under 300 yards, punched clean through Panzer IIs and Panzer IIIs. One Matilda commander, whose name survives in records simply as Sergeant King, led his tank through 4 Panzers, destroying all of them. The 2-pounder shot went right through the German tank's thin armour, setting 2 ablaze. German anti-tank crews found themselves helpless. The standard 37mm Pak-36 simply bounced rounds off Matilda armour. Crews watched in horror as their shells ricocheted skyward, while the British tanks ground forward inexorably, their 2-pounders methodically destroying anything in their path. Some German soldiers abandoned their positions and fled. Others fought desperately with whatever they had. The psychological impact was profound. These were veteran troops who had just conquered Poland and were sweeping through France. They had never encountered tanks they couldn't kill. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, found himself under direct attack when Matildas reached the positions of his motorized infantry regiment. Rommel personally organized the defense, racing from position to position in his command vehicle. What happened next would become legendary in both armies. Rommel ordered every gun that could engage the British tanks to form a defensive line. 105mm howitzers, designed for indirect fire, were laid flat and engaged the Matildas over open sights. More critically, 88mm anti-aircraft guns were pressed into service in the anti-tank role. The 88mm flak gun was not designed to fight tanks. It was a heavy, tall, conspicuous anti-aircraft weapon with a high silhouette and limited traverse. But it fired an 18-pound shell at 2,700 feet per second and at close range it could penetrate any armour in existence. Rommel formed a gun line of whatever was available. 105mm howitzers, 88mm flak guns, and any operational panzers. The hastily assembled defensive position held. The 88mm guns proved devastatingly effective. At ranges around 1,000 metres, they could punch through even Matilda Secu armour. The British attack, having penetrated up to 10 kilometres into German positions, was forced to halt as losses mounted. Of the 74 tanks that started the attack, 46 were destroyed or abandoned by nightfall, a 62% loss rate. The Battle of Arras was tactically a limited success for the British. They had panicked German units, destroyed around 20 panzers, captured 400 prisoners, and forced a temporary halt to the German advance. Strategically, the impact was greater. Hitler and the German High Command, already nervous about their exposed panzer corridor, ordered a pause in operations around Arras until the situation stabilised. This pause bought crucial time for Allied forces to fortify Dunkirk's approaches, making the eventual evacuation possible. But for the 2-pounder crews involved, the lessons were sobering. Their guns had been effective when they could engage at close range. Reports indicated that when Matilda Sek crews got within 300 yards of German tanks, their 2-pounders went through them easily. The problem was reaching that close range. German tanks and anti-tank guns could engage effectively at 800 to 1,000 metres, well beyond the 2-pounders' practical range. The gun crews were vulnerable throughout their approach. When the British finally reached close range, they were deadly, but getting there cost blood. The evacuation from Dunkirk spelled disaster for British anti-tank capability. Of the approximately 400 2-pounder guns that went to France, most were abandoned on the beaches or in the retreat. The guns were too heavy to carry off manually, and with vehicles in short supply and under constant air attack, they had to be left behind. The Germans captured hundreds of 2-pounders and pressed them into service as the 4.0cm Pak 192E, E for English, or Pak 154B, mistakenly attributed to Belgium. German forces would use captured 2-pounders throughout the war, finding them adequate against Soviet light and medium tanks, especially in the war's early years. For Britain, the loss was catastrophic. The army's infantry anti-tank capability was stripped away overnight. Woolwich Arsenal had already designed the 2-pounder's replacement, the 6-pounder, a 57mm gun with far superior penetration. In 1940, with production facilities tooled up and experience with the weapon, Britain might have transitioned to the new gun rapidly. But with invasion feared imminent and the army stripped of anti-tank weapons, a decision was made that would haunt the British Army for 2 years. Rather than retool for 6-pounder production, factories would continue building 2-pounders. The reasoning was logical in the crisis atmosphere of June 1940. Workers knew how to build 2-pounders, supplies and jigs were in place, training on the weapon was established. Transitioning to the 6-pounder would require retooling, retraining, and time. In an emergency, familiar weapons available now were judged more valuable than superior weapons available later. It was estimated that producing 100 6-pounders would displace production of 600 2-pounders. With German invasion expected at any moment, those 600 guns seemed essential. The decision was made: continue 2-pounder production, delay the 6-pounder until November 1941. Frontline availability would not occur until spring 1942. This meant British forces would fight with 2-pounders for another 2 years, during which time German tank armour would continue to thicken. The North African campaign would be fought almost entirely with 2-pounders, and British tank regiments would go into battle in France, North Africa, and eventually against the Japanese with 2-pounder armed tanks. The decision was understandable given the circumstances. Whether it was correct remains debated by historians. What is certain is that it committed British troops to fight with a gun that was already struggling against up-armoured German tanks, and that struggle would only intensify. When Italy declared war on Britain in June 1940, the North African theatre opened. Italian forces in Libya outnumbered the small British garrison in Egypt, but Italian tanks and anti-tank guns were inferior to their British counterparts. When General Richard O'Connor launched Operation Compass in December 1940, the results were spectacular. British forces, led by 7th Armoured Division and 4th Indian Division, attacked Italian fortified camps. The attack on the camp at Nebewa on December 9th demonstrated what the 2-pounder could do against thinly armoured opponents. 50 Matilda South tanks, now fully equipping the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, advanced with the attack. Italian anti-tank guns and tank guns bounced harmlessly off Matilda armour. Meanwhile, British 2-pounders systematically destroyed Italian M13 tanks with ease. The M13's frontal armour was only 30mm thick. At 500 yards, the 2-pounder went through it like cardboard. One Italian doctor, witnessing the attack, called the Matildas the nearest thing to hell I ever saw. Italian forces, spreading tales of invincible British tanks, surrendered by the thousands. The 2-pounder was proving its worth, but against opponents it had been designed to fight, tanks with armour protection from the mid-1930s. Operation Compass was a stunning success. British forces advanced hundreds of miles, captured 130,000 Italian prisoners, destroyed or captured hundreds of tanks and guns, and threatened to push Italy out of North Africa entirely. The Matilda had earned the nickname Queen of the Desert. Its thick armour made it nearly indestructible against Italian weapons. Its 2-pounder gun destroyed Italian tanks. With ease, British tank crews reported vehicles surviving dozens of hits without penetration. One commander noted 46 direct hits on his tank after a battle, with everything external lights, aerials, water cans shattered or missing, but the tank remained fully operational. The 2-pounder mounted in British tanks was proving highly effective in its intended role, but the situation was about to change dramatically. In February 1941, German forces arrived in North Africa. The German Afrika Korps, commanded by General Erwin Rommel, deployed with Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, and critically, with the lessons of Arras fresh in mind. The Germans knew British tanks with 2-pounders were deadly at close range but vulnerable to long-range fire. They developed tactics accordingly. German doctrine in North Africa emphasised the integration of anti-tank guns with armoured forces. Rather than tank versus tank combat, German commanders preferred to draw British tanks onto screens of anti-tank guns. Panzers would engage British forces, then withdraw, luring them forward. Hidden anti-tank guns would then open fire at long range, destroying British tanks before they could close to effective 2-pounder range. The Germans deployed 50mm Pak-38 anti-tank guns, which could penetrate 50mm of armour at 500 metres and 78mm at 100 metres with their upgraded ammunition. Against Matilda sets, the Pak-38 was marginal at long range but deadly if the British closed. More dangerous were the 88mm flak guns. Deployed in the anti-tank role as they had been at Arras, these weapons could destroy any British tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. The British found themselves in a tactical dilemma. Their 2-pounder armed tanks needed to close to 500 yards or less for reliable penetration of up-armoured German tanks. But closing that distance meant running a gauntlet of long-range German fire. British cruiser tanks, more lightly armoured than Matildas, were particularly vulnerable. They could be destroyed by 50mm tank guns at 800 metres, well before their own 2-pounders were effective. The open terrain of the North African desert exacerbated the problem. Unlike France, with its hedgerows, villages and rolling hills that offered cover and concealment, the desert was largely flat and featureless. Visibility extended for miles. German crews could spot British tanks at extreme range and engage with their longer-range weapons. British tactics emphasised speed and manoeuvre. Cruiser tanks were supposed to use their mobility to flank German positions, but speed provided no protection against high-velocity guns, and manoeuvring in open desert still meant exposure to long-range fire. The 2-pounder itself contributed to tactical problems. Towed 2-pounder anti-tank guns had a relatively high silhouette due to their cruciform carriage. In the flat desert, they were difficult to conceal. German crews could spot them at distance and engage with tank guns and artillery before the 2-pounders were in effective range. Even more seriously, towed 2-pounders proved fragile when towed long distances across rough desert. The 3-legged carriage, while providing excellent stability when emplaced, suffered from vibration and shock when bouncing across rocky terrain. Breakdowns were common. To address this, the British developed the portee method of transport. The 2-pounder would be loaded onto the back of a truck, typically a Morris commercial or similar vehicle, for movement. This protected the gun from road shock and allowed faster repositioning. The portee method was intended purely for transport. Crews were supposed to offload the gun before combat, but in the fluid, fast-moving battles of the desert, crews often found themselves engaging from the truck bed. This provided some advantages. The gun was already at a good firing height. The truck offered mobility for quick displacement. But it also made the crew incredibly vulnerable. A truck with a 2-pounder on the back presented a large, conspicuous target. The crew had no protection whatsoever. A single high-explosive shell or even machine gun fire could kill everyone. Despite the dangers, portee firing became common. It reflected the desperate tactical situation British anti-tank units faced. If they took time to dismount and emplace the gun properly, German tanks might overrun them or withdraw out of range. Firing from the portee at least allowed them to get shots off quickly, even at the cost of reduced accuracy and crew vulnerability. The statistics from 1941 tell a grim story. During Operation Battle Axe, the British attempt to relieve Tobruk in June 1941, British tank losses were catastrophic. German tank losses were approximately 1/8 of British losses. The 2-pounder proved inadequate except at very close range. British Matilda and Crusader tanks armed with 2-pounders had to close to suicidal distances to penetrate German armour, while German 50mm and 75mm guns destroyed them at standoff range. British commanders were forced to adapt. The excellent 25-pounder field gun, primarily an artillery piece, was increasingly used in the anti-tank role. The 25-pounder fired an 88mm projectile with good armour-piercing capability when using AP ammunition. It had reasonable penetration against medium tanks and could engage at longer range than the 2-pounder, but using field guns for anti-tank work meant diverting them from their primary artillery mission, weakening British fire support. It was a compromise born of necessity. The 2-pounder's reputation suffered during this period, but much of the criticism was unfair. The gun was being asked to perform in conditions it was never designed for. In 1934, when specifications were written, designers envisioned European terrain, where engagement ranges would be measured in hundreds of yards, not thousands. They envisioned concealment and cover that would allow guns to be positioned in ambush. They envisioned a tactical environment where getting within 500 yards of an enemy tank was feasible. None of those conditions existed in the North African desert. The open terrain, long sight lines, and German combined arms tactics negated the 2-pounder's strengths while highlighting its weaknesses. Yet when British crews could employ the weapon as designed, In prepared positions with good fields of fire and the element of surprise, the 2-pounder remained effective. During defensive actions, particularly at Tobruk, where 2-pounder crews had prepared positions and could engage at close range, the gun performed well. The problem was that British offensive operations required mobility and flexibility, conditions under which the 2-pounder struggled. By late 1941, newer German tanks were arriving that the 2-pounder simply couldn't defeat reliably. The Panzer III AUSFJ and later variants featured 50mm frontal armour, while the Panzer III Special, armed with the long 50mm L60 gun, had up-armoured frontal protection. The Panzer IV, initially an infantry support tank with a short 75mm howitzer, was being upgunned with the long 75mm KWK-40 gun. This weapon could penetrate 90mm of armour at 500 metres. Against this, the 2-pounder was hopelessly outmatched. A 2-pounder could only penetrate the frontal armour of these later tanks at extremely close range, under 200 metres, and even then success wasn't guaranteed depending on the angle of impact. British tankers and anti-tank gun crews developed enormous respect for their German opponents. German tactics were simply better. The integration of anti-tank guns with armour, the use of terrain even in seemingly featureless desert, the discipline to hold fire until British tanks were well within range, all of these marked professional, experienced forces. British tactics improved through painful experience, but the equipment disadvantage remained. When the 6-pounder finally arrived in spring 1942, it made an immediate impact. At the Battle of Gazala in May and June 1942, 6-pounder guns demonstrated they could penetrate any German tank in service. The famous action at Outpost Snipe during 2nd El Alamein saw 6-pounder crews of 2nd Battalion, the Rifle Brigade, destroy more than 15 Axis tanks. The 6-pounder, with 57mm caliber and much higher velocity, could engage German tanks at reasonable ranges with confidence. But 6-pounders were in short supply initially. Most British units continued with 2-pounders through much of 1942. It wasn't until after El Alamein that 6-pounders fully replaced 2-pounders in the Western Desert. British tanks transitioned even more slowly. The Crusader continued to mount 2-pounders through 1942. The Valentine carried the 2-pounder for much of its service life. Even the early Churchill tanks featured 2-pounders. The delays in 6-pounder production and the slow rearming of tank units meant British armoured forces fought much of the North African campaign with inadequate firepower. While the 2-pounder struggled in North Africa and Europe, it found renewed purpose in other theatres. Against Japanese armour in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the 2-pounder was more than adequate. Japanese tanks were generally lightly armoured. The Type 95 Heigo light tank, the most common Japanese tank, had armour less than an inch thick. The Type 97 Chiha medium tank featured only 1 inch of frontal armour. Against these targets, the 2-pounder was devastating. Australian forces defending Malaya and later New Guinea relied heavily on 2-pounders. During the Battle of Myr in January 1942, Australian 2-pounder crews of the 229th Battalion engaged Japanese tank attacks at close range. Lieutenant Ben Hackney's description captured the action. A couple of tanks attempted to turn and make a getaway, but still those boys with the anti-tank guns were sending a stream of shells into them. At last they could not move forward any further and became as pillboxes surrounded, sending fire in all directions, until one by one they were smashed, set on fire, and rendered useless and uninhabitable. There came then from the tanks sounds which resembled an Empire Day celebration, as the ammunition within them burnt and cracked with sharp bursts and hissed, with every now and again a louder explosion as larger ammunition ignited. The 2-pounder could penetrate Japanese armour at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. Against the Type 97 it could kill at extreme range. Against the Type 95, penetration was guaranteed at any practical engagement distance. The tactical situation in the Pacific differed dramatically from North Africa. Jungle terrain provided abundant cover and concealment. Engagement ranges were measured in yards, not thousands of meters. Ambush tactics were not only possible but standard. Japanese combined arms tactics were far less sophisticated than German. These conditions played to the 2-pounder's strengths. Australian crews became expert at positioning guns in ambush, waiting until Japanese tanks were at point-blank range, then opening fire with devastating effect. The close terrain meant Japanese tankers had no opportunity to stand off and engage at range. By the time they saw the 2-pounder position, they were already well within its kill zone. The 2-pounder remained in service in the Pacific Theatre long after it had been withdrawn from Europe and North Africa. Australian forces used 2-pounders through the end of the war in New Guinea and Borneo. The gun was reliable, well understood, and completely adequate for the threats faced. Efforts were made to extend the 2-pounder's service life even in Europe. The most successful was the Little John adapter, developed late in the war. This device used the squeeze-bore principle. A tungsten carbide cord projectile, 40mm in diameter with soft driving bands, was fired through an adapter 17.5 inches long that gradually tapered the bore down to 30mm. As the projectile passed through the adapter, the driving bands folded down and the projectile was squeezed to smaller diameter. This increased velocity by approximately 1,600 feet per second and dramatically improved penetration. A 2-pounder with Little John adapter could penetrate up to 75mm of armour at combat ranges, making it comparable to the 6-pounder without the adapter. The Little John equipped 2-pounder was designated Mark XB. It was primarily used on Daimler armoured cars, giving them effective anti-tank capability against most targets. However, the Little John adapter permanently prevented the weapon from firing standard ammunition. The projectile had to pass through the adapter taper, which meant high explosive ammunition, had it been available, could never be used. The adapter also required tungsten carbide, a strategic material in short supply. Production of Little John adapters and special ammunition was limited. Most 2-pounders never received the upgrade. Another attempted improvement was the 2-pounder David gun. This experimental weapon used a 2-pounder projectile in a necked-down 6-pounder cartridge case, achieving performance nearly equal to the 6-pounder. But the gun was bigger, heavier, and offered no real advantage over either the 2-pounder or 6-pounder. Development was abandoned. By 1942, the writing was on the wall. The 2-pounder was obsolete in Europe and North Africa. The 6-pounder was superior in every measurable way. British tank designers were already working on mounting 75mm guns and planning for the 17-pounder. The 2-pounder's time had passed, but its legacy remained. The gun had equipped the first successful British tank actions of the war at Arras and in the early Desert Campaign. It had been the backbone of British anti-tank defence during the invasion scare of 1940 and 1941. It had destroyed hundreds of Axis tanks when employed correctly, and in the Pacific it continued serving effectively until war's end. The lessons learned from the 2-pounder's service were invaluable. British designers understood that calibre and muzzle velocity needed to be prioritised for anti-tank weapons. The 6-pounder reflected this lesson. At 57mm, with muzzle velocity around 2,900 feet per second, it had the penetration to defeat contemporary German tanks at reasonable range. The 17-pounder took the lesson further, with 76.2mm calibre and velocity approaching 3,000 feet per second, making it one of the war's most effective anti-tank guns. The importance of high explosive ammunition was also recognised. Future British anti-tank guns all had rounds available, ensuring crews could engage soft targets and suppress enemy positions. The 2-pounder's lack of HE had been a constant handicap. Designers also learned that very heavy guns were acceptable if performance justified the weight. The 17-pounder weighed over 6,000 pounds in action, more than 3 times the 2-pounder's weight, but its capability made it worthwhile. The British Army learned tactical lessons as well. Combined arms warfare integrating tanks, anti-tank guns, artillery and infantry was essential. The German model, using anti-tank guns to support armour rather than armour operating independently, proved superior. British forces adopted these methods, improving their effectiveness dramatically. The importance of engagement range was driven home painfully. In the desert, British tanks and anti-tank guns needed to match German effective ranges or accept catastrophic casualties. This led to greater emphasis on long-range gunnery training and fire control. The value of ambush tactics, particularly in close terrain, was reaffirmed. When British crews could position 2-pounders in defilade, concealed until the last moment, and engage at close range with surprise, the gun was deadly. This validated the original tactical concept, even if circumstances in North Africa had prevented its effective employment. Statistically, over 2,000 2-pounder anti-tank guns were produced during the war. Thousands more were mounted in British tanks. The Matilda II, Valentine, Crusader, early Churchill, and various armoured cars all carried 2-pounders as primary armament. In tank versus tank combat, 2-pounder armed British tanks claimed hundreds of German, Italian and Japanese vehicles destroyed. The exact number is impossible to determine, as many battles saw multiple British units with different weapons all engaging the same targets, making attribution difficult. What is certain is that the 2-pounder served as Britain's primary tank gun from 1939 through much of 1942, the war's critical early years. As an anti-tank gun in Royal Artillery service, the 2-pounder equipped infantry divisions, armoured divisions, and independent anti-tank units. It was the only British anti-tank gun in quantity production when war began, and remained so until the 6-pounder arrived. Crews manning these guns faced German Panzers at Arras, in the desert, in Greece, in Southeast Asia. They learned to maximise the weapon's strengths, positioning carefully, holding fire for close-range shots, using terrain and concealment. The best 2-pounder crews developed reputations as tank killers. They knew the gun's limitations but also its capabilities. At 500 yards, a well-aimed 2-pounder shot would punch through most medium tank armour of the early war period. Crews learned to aim for weak points, turret rings, hull sides, engine decks. They learned that the semi-automatic breech allowed rapid follow-up shots. A trained crew could put 5 or 6 rounds into a target in under 30 seconds. Volume of fire, concentration, and precision shooting compensated somewhat for lack of individual projectile effectiveness. Against lightly armoured vehicles, scout cars, half-tracks, trucks, the 2-pounder was devastating. The solid shot projectile travelling at high velocity would pass completely through such targets, often continuing through, and hitting whatever was behind. Single shots disabled multiple vehicles if they were in column. The gun's 360-degree traverse proved valuable in fast-moving engagements. When German tanks attempted to flank British positions, 2-pounder crews could quickly traverse to engage threats from any direction. The traverse gear allowed smooth tracking of moving targets, important when engaging tanks moving at 15 to 20 miles per hour across open ground. Reliability was another strength. The 2-pounder mechanism, while sophisticated, was robust. Stoppages were rare. Even in the dust and sand of the desert, with minimal maintenance, guns continued functioning. The semi-automatic breech rarely failed. The recoil system remained consistent. Sights held 0 reasonably well despite rough handling and transport. Crew training on the 2-pounder was extensive. British gunners were drilled on recognition, learning to identify German and Italian tanks at a glance. They studied armour layouts, learning where enemy tanks were most vulnerable. They practiced rapid emplacement, getting the gun into action from travelling configuration in under a minute. They practiced engagement drills, loader and gunner working in coordination until loading and firing became smooth and automatic. This training paid dividends in combat. Well-trained crews were significantly more effective than green crews, able to engage faster, aim more accurately and reposition more quickly. The human element of 2-pounder operations deserves emphasis. These were not crews of professional soldiers. Most were civilians before the war, clerks, farmers, factory workers, students. They volunteered or were conscripted, put through training, and sent to face German Panzers with a gun that was rapidly becoming obsolete. Their courage and adaptability cannot be overstated. Facing German tanks across open desert, knowing their 2-pounder might not penetrate at the ranges where the Germans could kill them, they stood their ground. Reports from North Africa describe gun crews engaging at suicidally close ranges because that was the only way to be effective. Portee-mounted 2-pounders fired from truck beds while under direct fire, crew members standing fully exposed because there was no other option. In defensive positions, crews held fire as German tanks approached, letting them close to point-blank range, knowing that opening fire too early would mean death, but waiting gave them a fighting chance. At Tobruk, during the long siege, 2-pounder crews became experts at ambush tactics. They prepared positions overlooking approaches, camouflaged carefully, and waited. When German or Italian tanks advanced, expecting to breach the perimeter, they rolled into kill zones where 2-pounders waited at ranges measured in dozens of yards. The results were devastating. Panzers exploded, burned, or stalled with penetrated armour. Survivors withdrew. The siege held. These actions didn't make headlines. There were no dramatic photographs of 2-pounder crews in action, no famous images like the 88mm guns that became iconic. But the cumulative effect of hundreds of small actions, guns positioned correctly, crews trained well, shooting accurately at close range, was significant. They blunted attacks, they destroyed tanks, they bought time for reinforcements, for repositioning, for the larger strategic situation to develop. The 2-pounder served honourably in a role it was never designed for, against opponents it was never meant to face, in terrain where its weaknesses were magnified and its strengths minimised. That it remained effective at all speaks to the quality of the design, the training of the crews, and the courage of the men who served the gun. By 1943, the 2-pounder was being withdrawn from frontline service in Europe and North Africa. The 6-pounder replaced it in anti-tank regiments. New tank designs mounted 75mm guns or prepared for the 17-pounder. The 2-pounder was relegated to training, home defence and secondary theatres, but it had done its job. It had equipped the British Army when nothing else was available. It had given British forces a fighting chance in the desperate days of 1940 and 1941. It had destroyed enemy armour in France, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Its crews had learned lessons, paid in blood, that informed the development of better weapons and better tactics. When veterans gathered after the war, 2-pounder crews spoke of their gun with mixture of affection and frustration. They knew its limitations intimately. They had faced German tanks that their rounds bounced off. They had watched comrades die because they couldn't engage effectively at range. But they also remembered the times when the gun worked as designed. When a carefully positioned 2-pounder caught a Panzer III at 300 yards and put a round straight through its frontal armour. When rapid fire from a well-trained crew destroyed 2 tanks in under a minute. When a portee-mounted gun got off a snapshot that stopped a German advance. These memories mattered. The 2-pounder may not have been the war's most powerful anti-tank gun, but it was the gun British soldiers had when they needed it, and they made it work. In museums today, 2-pounder guns sit among other wartime artefacts. To casual observers, they seem small, almost delicate compared to massive 88mm guns or American 90mm weapons. But those who know the history see something different. They see a weapon that held the line when Britain stood alone. They see the gun that armed Matildas at Arras, that destroyed Italian tanks in the desert, that defended Tobruk, that stopped Japanese armour in Malaya and New Guinea. The 2-pounder's story is ultimately one of British determination during the war's darkest period. When the design was outdated, they kept using it because they had nothing better. When tactics didn't suit the weapon, they adapted the tactics. When the gun couldn't penetrate, at long range they found ways to fight at close range. They made do, they improvised, they endured. That's the real legacy of the British 2-pounder, not technical superiority or battlefield dominance, but the refusal to give up even when the equipment was inadequate and the odds were against them. The men who served the 2-pounder gun in combat understood something fundamental about warfare. Battles are won not just with superior equipment, but with training, courage, and the will to close with the enemy despite the danger. The 2-pounder, for all its limitations, gave them a weapon they could use to fight back. At close range, properly employed, it could kill. And so they got close. They employed it properly, and they killed. In the final analysis, that's what mattered. The British 2-pounder ambushed Panzers at close range not because it was the ideal weapon for the job, but because it was the weapon British soldiers had, and they refused to let inadequate equipment stop them from fighting. They learned the gun, mastered its strengths, compensated for its weaknesses, and used it to destroy hundreds of enemy tanks across multiple theatres and 3 years of war. That achievement, born of necessity and sustained by courage, stands as the true measure of the 2-pounder's place in history. The question of what might have been haunts the 2-pounder's history. If Britain had possessed the industrial capacity and foresight to transition to the 6-pounder immediately after Dunkirk, how many lives might have been saved? The debate has occupied military historians for decades. Some argue the decision to continue 2-pounder production was a catastrophic error, that accepting a temporary shortage of anti-tank guns in late 1940 and early 1941 would have been worthwhile to field superior weapons by mid-1941. Others maintain that given the invasion threat, Britain had no choice. The nation needed anti-tank guns immediately in quantity, and the 2-pounder was the only weapon that could be produced quickly enough. The counterfactual arguments are compelling on both sides. Had 6-pounders been available for Operation Crusader in November 1941, British tank losses might have been significantly reduced. The long-range penetration capability would have allowed British units to engage German armour on more equal terms. Rommel's tactical advantages would have been reduced, but would Britain have survived 1940 and early 1941 with drastically reduced anti-tank capability? The question cannot be answered definitively. What is known is that the men who made the decision believed they had no alternative, and the circumstances they faced were genuinely desperate. The production statistics reveal the scale of Britain's commitment to the 2-pounder despite its known limitations. From 1940 through 1942, British and Canadian factories produced the weapon at remarkable rates. At peak production in 1941, guns were rolling off assembly lines at more than 100 per month. This represented an enormous investment of resources, skilled labour and industrial capacity. Every 2-pounder produced was one that could have been a 6-pounder, had the transition been made earlier. But every 2-pounder produced was also a weapon in the hands of soldiers who desperately needed something, anything, to stop German tanks. The Canadian production of 2-pounders represents one of war's ironies. Canadian factories produced substantial numbers of guns under license, yet Canadian forces in combat would use primarily American 37mm and later 57mm guns, or British 6-pounders. The Canadian-made 2-pounders went to British units, to Commonwealth forces, and into storage. Some ended up with training units that never saw combat. The Canadian industrial contribution was vital for British rearmament, but Canadian soldiers themselves never fought with the weapon. Their factories had produced in such quantity. The 2-pounder's service in less prominent theatres deserves more recognition than it typically receives. While North Africa dominates popular history of the Desert War, 2-pounders served throughout the Middle East. In Syria during the 1941 campaign against Vichy French forces, Australian 2-pounder crews engaged French Renault R-35 tanks. The R-35's 40mm frontal armour was vulnerable to 2-pounder fire at combat ranges, and several were destroyed in the brief campaign. In Iraq during the 1941 revolt, 2-pounders equipped British forces suppressing the uprising. In Persia during the Anglo-Soviet invasion in August 1941, 2-pounders accompanied British columns advancing into Iran, though no significant armour engagements occurred. Greek and Crete campaigns saw limited 2-pounder deployment. British and Commonwealth forces rushed to Greece in spring 1941 had limited heavy equipment. Some 2-pounder batteries deployed but found themselves facing the familiar problem of German combined arms tactics and superior armour. During the withdrawal and evacuation, most guns were abandoned. On Crete, a few 2-pounders formed part of the island's defences when German airborne forces attacked in May 1941. The guns saw little use against armour, as German paratroops arrived by air and glider, but provided direct fire support against infantry attacks. Most were destroyed or captured when the island fell. The Burma campaign of 1942 saw 2-pounders in action against Japanese armour during the long retreat. British and Indian Army units withdrawing toward India had limited anti-tank weapons, but those 2-pounder crews present found the gun highly effective against Japanese Type 95 and Type 97 tanks. The jungle terrain suited ambush tactics perfectly. Japanese tanks advancing along roads or tracks could be engaged at close range from concealed positions. Several actions saw single 2-pounder guns destroy multiple Japanese tanks before withdrawing. The weapon proved its worth when terrain and tactics aligned with its design characteristics. In the Atlantic theatres, 2-pounder guns found unexpected employment as ship armament. Royal Navy vessels mounting 2-pounders used them primarily against aircraft and small surface targets. The high velocity and flat trajectory made the gun effective against E-boats and similar fast attack craft. The automatic breech allowed rapid fire against aircraft, though the small projectile weight limited effectiveness. Merchant ships in convoy sometimes mounted 2-pounders for defence against surface raiders. While primarily symbolic given the light armour-piercing ammunition's limitations against warship armour, the weapons provided some means of resistance and boosted crew morale. The development of specialised ammunition for the 2-pounder came too late to affect the weapon's combat employment significantly. Beyond the standard armour-piercing shot, experiments produced several variants. Armour-piercing capped ammunition, with a soft metal cap to improve penetration against face-hardened armour, was developed but produced in limited quantities. The cap helped the projectile bite into hardened armour surfaces, rather than shattering on impact. Against homogeneous armour, the improvement was marginal. Against face-hardened plates, penetration increased by perhaps 10 to 15%. But by the time APC ammunition reached field units in quantity, most were transitioning to 6-pounders. Armor-piercing capped ballistic cap ammunition, with an additional streamlined cap to reduce air resistance and maintain velocity, was tested but never produced for the 2-pounder in significant numbers. The ballistic cap improved long-range performance slightly, but given the 2-pounder's fundamental caliber limitations, the improvement wasn't enough to justify the added complexity and cost. For the 6-pounder and larger guns, APCBC became standard. For the 2-pounder, it remained experimental. Tracer ammunition allowed crews to observe shot trajectory, particularly valuable when engaging moving targets at medium range. The tracer element burned brightly enough to be visible in daylight, helping gunners adjust aim. However, the tracer added weight and slightly reduced armor penetration. Most crews preferred standard AP shot for armor engagement, and used tracer only for ranging or target indication. Practice ammunition with inert projectiles was produced in large quantities for training. The practice rounds matched the ballistics of service ammunition, closely enough that gunners trained on practice rounds could transition seamlessly to combat loads. The question of crew survival rates for 2-pounder anti-tank guns versus other weapons is difficult to establish with precision. Casualty records often don't differentiate between different anti-tank gun types, and infantry casualties are reported by unit rather than by specific role. What evidence exists suggests 2-pounder crews in North Africa suffered elevated casualties compared to 6-pounder crews later in the war, likely reflecting the necessity of engaging at closer ranges, where German return fire was more accurate and deadly. Portee-mounted gun crews faced particularly high casualty rates when firing from trucks. The complete exposure of the crew made them vulnerable to machine gun fire, artillery fragments, and direct hits. Several accounts describe entire gun crews killed or wounded by single bursts of fire. In defensive positions with proper preparation, 2-pounder crews fared better. Well-prepared gun pits with overhead cover for the crew, ammunition storage in protected bays, and carefully planned fields of fire allowed crews to survive even when their positions were located and engaged. The gun's relatively small size made it easier to conceal than larger weapons. A properly camouflaged 2-pounder position could be nearly invisible until the gun opened fire. German tank crews reported frustration at encountering 2-pounder ambushes where they never saw the gun before being hit. The first indication of the gun's presence was the impact of the round striking their tank. Training evolution for 2-pounder crews shows how tactical doctrine adapted to combat experience. Early training emphasized mechanical gun drill, rapid emplacement, and basic marksmanship. Crews learned to estimate range by eye and engage static targets. As combat reports filtered back from France and North Africa, training became more sophisticated. Crews practiced engaging moving targets, learned to lead moving tanks, and trained on shot placement for maximum effect. Training emphasized patience, holding fire until targets reached close range rather than engaging at maximum range with reduced probability of penetration. Advanced training included recognition of German tank types at various ranges and angles. Crews learned that a Panzer III seen from the front at 800 yards was nearly invulnerable to their gun, but the same tank at 400 yards could be penetrated with careful shot placement. They learned that side armour was significantly thinner than frontal armour. A Panzer IV with 50 mm of frontal armour had only 30 mm on the hull sides. A side shot at 600 yards was more likely to penetrate than a frontal shot at 300 yards. This knowledge informed tactics. Crews positioned to achieve flanking shots whenever possible. Camouflage instruction became increasingly detailed. Crews learned that in the desert, guns needed to be positioned to avoid casting shadows that were visible from a distance. They learned to use the minimal vegetation available, building hides from scrub brush and netting. They learned that disturbed earth around gun positions created telltale marks visible from the air and at a distance, so positions needed to be prepared carefully to minimize soil disturbance. In jungle environments, the techniques differed. Dense vegetation allowed complete concealment, but crews needed to ensure clear fields of fire without creating obvious clearings that would reveal their positions. Psychological training addressed the fear of facing armour. Tank phobia was a recognized phenomenon among infantry and anti-tank crews. The sound of approaching armour, the ground shaking under tracks, the imposing size of a Panzer IV or Tiger, all created visceral fear. Training attempted to condition crews to suppress that fear and perform their tasks mechanically. Realistic training with friendly tanks advancing on gun positions helped somewhat. but nothing fully prepared crews for the experience of watching enemy armour approach while holding fire until they reached point-blank range. The 2-pounder's mechanical simplicity was both blessing and curse. The weapon had relatively few complex parts, making field maintenance straightforward. Crews could perform most repairs with basic tools. The recoil system, elevating mechanism and traverse gear were robust enough to function even when damaged. Guns hit by shell fragments often remained operational if the barrel wasn't damaged. The semi-automatic breech was sophisticated but proved reliable. Failures were rare enough that most crews served entire campaigns without experiencing a mechanical stoppage in combat. However, this simplicity meant there was little room for field modification or improvement. Unlike some weapons where crews could develop unofficial improvements or workarounds, the 2-pounder was essentially a finished design. The only significant field modification commonly seen was removing the shield from some towed guns to reduce weight and improve concealment. The shield offered limited protection anyway, and its removal made the gun less conspicuous. This was particularly common on portee-mounted guns, where the truck's bulk already made concealment difficult. Resupply of ammunition was generally adequate, though with occasional shortages. The 2-pounder used a relatively small round that could be transported in quantity. Standard loads for towed guns included immediate-ready ammunition in the shield lockers and additional rounds in limbers or vehicles. Tank-mounted 2-pounders had more limited storage. The Matilda II carried 93 rounds of 2-pounder ammunition, which sounds substantial until combat consumption is considered. In an intense engagement, a tank could exhaust its ammunition in minutes of sustained firing. The logistics of supporting 2-pounder equipped units were simpler than for larger caliber weapons. The ammunition was light enough that manual handling was straightforward. A single soldier could easily carry multiple rounds. Resupply vehicles could carry hundreds of rounds. This contrasted with larger guns where ammunition weight required mechanical handling equipment. From a logistics perspective, the 2-pounder's light ammunition was an advantage, allowing forward units to maintain larger ammunition stocks with less transport burden. The experience of 2-pounder crews varied enormously depending on theatre, opponent and timing. A crew serving in North Africa in 1941 faced the most difficult conditions. They fought in extreme heat under air attack against sophisticated opponents with superior equipment. Their gun was inadequate for the tactical situation they faced. Their survival depended on skill, luck, and the courage to close to suicidal ranges. These crews developed enormous respect for their German opponents and frustration with their own equipment. Many questioned why they were sent into battle with weapons they knew to be inadequate. A crew serving in the Pacific in 1943 had a completely different experience. They fought in jungle terrain against lightly armoured Japanese tanks. Their 2-pounder was more than adequate for the threats faced. They could position guns in ambush with excellent concealment. Engagement ranges were short by necessity, playing to the gun's strengths. These crews generally regarded the 2-pounder as an effective weapon, reliable and powerful enough for their needs. The contrast in crew attitudes toward the same weapon in different contexts illustrates how tactical environment shaped effectiveness. Home defence units in Britain had yet another experience. They trained intensively on 2-pounders, preparing for an invasion that never came. They dug gun positions, covering approaches to beaches and likely landing zones. They rehearsed engagement procedures until they could perform them in darkness. But they never fired their guns in anger. For these crews, the 2-pounder was an abstract object, studied and maintained but never tested. When invasion fears receded in 1942 and 1943, these guns were gradually withdrawn, replaced by newer weapons or reassigned to training units. The social dynamics within gun crews created tight bonds. A 2-pounder crew typically consisted of 4 to 6 men, commander, gunner, loader, and additional crew members for ammunition supply and security. These men worked in extremely close quarters under intense stress. Crew cohesion was essential. A well-functioning crew operated smoothly, each man knowing his role and performing it without hesitation. Communication was minimal during engagements. Everyone knew the drill. The loader had the next round ready before the breach opened. The gunner tracked targets smoothly. The commander selected targets and gave minimal corrections. Poor crew cohesion was obvious and dangerous. Hesitation, miscommunication, or lack of coordination could be fatal. A loader who fumbled rounds, a gunner who couldn't track smoothly, a commander who gave unclear orders, Any of these failures could result in missed shots, slower rates of fire, or failure to engage effectively. Training emphasized building crew cohesion, but combat stress tested it. Crews that held together under fire, maintaining discipline and coordination when rounds were impacting around them, were the ones who survived and succeeded. The emotional toll of anti-tank combat left lasting impacts. Watching German tanks approach, while waiting to fire, required extraordinary nerve. Opening fire and seeing rounds bounce off. Armour was demoralizing. Watching nearby crews die when their positions were located and destroyed was traumatic. The few seconds or minutes of actual combat were preceded by hours of tension and followed by either relief, if the crew survived, or death if they didn't. Men who served in anti-tank units developed particular psychological profiles. They needed steady nerves, ability to function under stress, and capacity to make rapid decisions under pressure. Post-traumatic stress, though not recognized by that term during the war, affected many anti-tank veterans. The specific trauma of facing armour, of being hunted by mobile, powerful enemies while relatively immobile themselves, created lasting anxiety. Some veterans reported years of nightmares featuring approaching tanks. Others developed exaggerated startle responses to loud noises or ground vibrations. The psychological impact of their service was real and lasting, though rarely discussed in the immediate post-war period. The technical specifications of the 2-pounder tell only part of the story. On paper, the gun was a reasonable anti-tank weapon for the mid-1930s. In practice, its effectiveness depended entirely on how it was employed. The same gun that bounced rounds off German armour at 800 metres in the desert punched clean through Japanese tanks at 1,500 metres in the jungle. The weapon itself hadn't changed. The tactical context had. This lesson, that weapon effectiveness cannot be divorced from tactical employment, seems obvious in retrospect but had to be learned through painful experience. British development of anti-tank doctrine evolved throughout the war, with 2-pounder experience informing later practice. Early doctrine emphasized linear defense, with anti-tank guns positioned along expected attack routes. This proved inadequate against German infiltration tactics and combined arms coordination. Later doctrine emphasized defense in depth, with multiple layers of anti-tank guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Guns in forward positions would engage initially, then fall back to secondary positions if pressed. This allowed for flexible defense and prevented German forces from simply overwhelming forward gun lines. The concept of killing zones became central to British anti-tank tactics. Rather than trying to engage German armour at maximum range, doctrine evolved to emphasise drawing German tanks into carefully prepared areas where multiple guns could engage simultaneously at close range. This required considerable discipline. Forward observers and screening forces had to withdraw without engaging, luring German tanks forward. Anti-tank guns had to hold fire while targets approached. Then, at a predetermined point, all guns would open fire simultaneously. The sudden massed fire from multiple directions at close range proved devastating when executed properly. These tactics worked best in terrain that channeled enemy movement. In the desert's open terrain, creating effective killing zones was difficult. In Italy's mountains and close terrain, or in northwest Europe's bocage country, the tactics worked exceptionally well. The 2-pounder's operational history helped develop these doctrines, even though by the time they were fully refined, 6-pounders and 17-pounders had replaced the 2-pounder in European service. The relationship between 2-pounder crews and tank crews they supported was complex. Infantry appreciated having anti-tank guns available for defence, but tensions existed. Tank crews sometimes viewed anti-tank gunners as static, defensive-minded troops lacking the offensive spirit of armoured forces. Anti-tank gun crews sometimes viewed tank crews as reckless, charging forward without adequately suppressing enemy anti-tank defences. These tensions reflected different tactical roles and perspectives. Tank crews thought in terms of mobility and offensive action. Anti-tank crews thought in terms of position, fields of fire and defensive strength. Despite tensions, mutual respect developed through shared combat experience. Tank crews appreciated anti-tank guns when defending against counterattacks. Anti-tank gun crews appreciated tank support when their positions were threatened. In the best units, armour and anti-tank forces worked closely together, each understanding the other's capabilities and limitations. The combined force was far more effective than either arm operating independently. The 2-pounder's final years of service saw the weapon relegated to increasingly secondary roles. By 1944, frontline British units in Europe and Italy had completely re-equipped with 6-pounders and 17-pounders. The 2-pounder remained in use for training, coastal defence, and in theatres where Japanese armour remained the primary threat. Even in Pacific theatres, as heavier guns became available, the 2-pounder was gradually withdrawn. By war's end, most 2-pounders were in storage or had been scrapped for metal reclamation. Some 2-pounders found post-war service in unlikely places. Several nations acquired surplus British equipment after the war, and 2-pounders were included in various aid packages. Some equipped newly independent nations' armies for years after 1945. The gun's simplicity and reliability made it suitable for armies with limited technical infrastructure. Reports suggest some 2-pounders remained in service into the 1950s in various armies worldwide, though by then they were hopelessly obsolete and suitable only for training or ceremonial purposes. The preserved examples that survive today are maintained in military museums across the Commonwealth. Imperial War Museum in London has several 2-pounders on display. The Tank Museum at Bovington has examples mounted in period tanks. Australian War Memorial in Canberra displays 2-pounders that served in the Pacific. These preserved weapons allow modern observers to appreciate the gun's design and understand its size compared to contemporary weapons. Standing next to a 2-pounder, one is struck by how small it seems compared to the massive 88mm and 17-pounder guns displayed nearby. Yet this small gun armed Britain's tanks and anti-tank units during the war's most desperate years. Scholarly assessment of the 2-pounder has evolved over decades. Immediate post-war histories, written by participants still frustrated by the weapon's inadequacy in North Africa, were generally critical. The decision to continue production after Dunkirk was questioned. The lack of high explosive ammunition was cited as a serious failing. The gun's limited penetration against up-armoured German tanks was emphasised. These criticisms were valid but incomplete. Later historical analysis, with access to broader sources and documents, provided more nuanced assessment. The pre-war design criteria the 2-pounder met were reasonable given what was known in the mid-1930s. The gun's technical sophistication was impressive. The decision to continue production in 1940, while costly in the long term, was defensible given the immediate crisis. The lack of GI ammunition reflected flawed doctrine, but was consistent with how other nations approached small-caliber anti-tank guns. The gun performed well in appropriate tactical circumstances, as demonstrated in the Pacific and in ambush situations elsewhere. Modern military historians generally view the 2-pounder as a weapon that served its purpose adequately within its design limitations, but was retained in service too long due to production decisions that prioritized immediate availability over future capability. It stands as an example of how weapons developed for one type of warfare can become obsolete when conditions change. It also demonstrates how doctrine, tactics, and training can partially compensate for equipment shortcomings. The courage and skill of 2-pounder crews made the weapon more effective than its specifications suggested it should be. The veterans who served the 2-pounder are nearly all gone now. The youngest would be approaching 100 years old. Their stories, recorded in interviews and memoirs, provide irreplaceable insights into how the weapon actually functioned in combat. These accounts describe the smell of cordite after firing, the ring in one's ears after an engagement, the heat radiating from the barrel after sustained firing. They describe the moment of relief when a round penetrated and enemy tank stopped, and the moment of terror when a round bounced and the tank kept coming. They describe comrades killed, positions overrun, desperate withdrawals and occasional triumphs. These human stories matter more than technical specifications. The 2-pounder was never just a piece of equipment. It was a tool used by human beings in mortal combat. Its effectiveness depended on the men who served it, and those men faced impossible situations with inadequate equipment and made it work through skill and courage. Their achievement deserves recognition. They held the line when Britain stood alone. They destroyed enemy armour despite operating at a disadvantage. They adapted, improvised, and refused to give up. The legacy of the 2-pounder extends beyond its combat record. The weapon represents a particular moment in British history when the nation faced existential threat with inadequate preparation. It represents the industrial mobilisation that eventually overcame initial weakness. It represents the learning process of modern warfare, where pre-war assumptions were tested and found wanting. Most importantly, it represents the soldiers who fought with what they had, rather than what they wished they had, and who won despite everything. In analysing weapons of the Second World War, there's tendency to focus on the spectacular. The Tiger tank, the 88mm gun, the 17-pounder, weapons that inspired fear and respect. The 2-pounder inspires neither. It was ordinary, adequate rather than excellent, obsolescent almost from the moment it entered service. Yet it equipped British forces during critical years. It was present at Arras, at Tobruk, in Burma, in New Guinea. It destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles. It gave British soldiers a weapon to fight back with when they desperately needed one. That mundane effectiveness, that steady if unspectacular performance, that refusal to be completely inadequate even when outmatched, perhaps represents something essentially British about the weapon. It did its job without complaint, without drama, without calling attention to itself. It wasn't the best, but it was good enough. And in warfare, good enough combined with courage and determination often proves sufficient. The story of the British 2-pounder is ultimately a story about making do, about facing superior opponents with inferior equipment and refusing to surrender, about crews who closed to point-blank range because that was the only way their gun could be effective, about soldiers who stood their ground when every tactical manual said they should retreat, about a nation that continued fighting when conquered seemed inevitable, using whatever weapons it possessed, including a small 40mm gun that history would judge inadequate but which, in the moment, was all they had. And for 3 crucial years, it was enough.